If you're on YouTube watching gaming videos, then chances are I don't gotta tell you what The Legend of Zelda is. But just in case you've been living under a butt for the past 30 years, it's a gaming franchise about a man named Zelda and his quest to save his wife Gretchen from the evil King Paul. It doesn't get much more riveting than that, and as you might imagine, this winning concept spawned dozens of sequels and spin-offs, which can make the series a little overwhelming for newcomers to get into. So that's why I've taken it upon myself to place every single Zelda game into tiers, starting with F and going all the way up to S for some reason. The only real rules I have for this is that while every official release in the franchise is going to be included, I'm not going to treat ports like they're separate games. Instead, I'm just going to pick whichever versions I think are the best. Also, I'm not going to take nostalgia or cultural impact into consideration. This list is solely going to be based on how fun I think the games are. And lastly, I'm not going to say The Legend of Zelda before introducing every title. With all that being said though, my name's CameronAllOneWord, and let's waste one more second and jump right into the F tier. Zelda's Adventure, Wand of Gamelon, and Faces of Evil for the Philips CDI. The fact that I'm acknowledging these games even exist is probably gonna get me a little bit of pee-pee in my cereal, but they are officially licensed, and hey, at least I'm putting them in the F tier. Back in the 90s, Nintendo actually gave Philips the keys to drive the Zelda franchise around for not 1, not 2, not 4, but 3 games. And needless to say, this left a pretty big dent in the franchise after it was all said and done.
There's not even a dent.
Brand new car!
It's a 96!
There's a lot more to it than that, but most of you probably already know the story, and it doesn't even matter anyway, because all you need to know is that these random games made by Russian developers all suck horse meat. Link's crossbow training. Hey, don't go anywhere. I promise I'm gonna get to the real games. I just gotta include everything. It's really not fair to call Link's crossbow training a bad game per se, but the little bit of content that's actually here barely even qualifies it as one. It's pretty much just a tech demo for the Wii Zapper, but even so, it's only moderately fun for like 2 minutes. And I'm actually curious about what the world's average playtime for this game was. I'd be stunned if it was more than like 15 minutes tops. Now that the worst is behind us though, let's skip the E tier for some reason and move on to the D tier. Hyrule Warriors. I feel kinda bad putting this here, because while I haven't actually beaten it yet, I really do like it. But I don't know, it's one of those games I play for like an hour or two and then I just say,
Okay, I get it.
I'm not gonna call it repetitive, because I actually already did that before and someone in the comments reminded me that every game's repetitive, and it warped my fragile little mind, because it's kinda true if you think about it. So I guess all I'm really gonna say is that this game just didn't do a good job at hooking me. I don't mind that it's a hack and slash spin-off, and I'm not saying it's a bad game. In fact, the fan service alone makes it worth the purchase. It's just that I don't think it's better than very many of the core Zelda games, because the Zelda series is one of the best video game franchises of all time, so even the D tier is still gonna be pretty good. The Legend of Zelda. Pee on me if you must, but as awesome as this game truly is, especially for the time it came out, and the series just did a really good job in improving things ever since. If anything, placing the first game in the D tier is only complimenting Nintendo for upping the ante over the years. But even though it's still pretty fun to play today, it's just a little too cryptic for my liking. Burning every random bush in the entire game sounds like a pretty good time back in the 80s, but 30 years later, we could read, stream, and play pretty much every book, movie, or game ever made, so I'm sorry, I just got better things to do. If you want to play it, you can, but I mean, I'm not gonna. Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. Like Mario, the second game's pretty much the black sheep of the entire franchise, because at the time, there weren't really many video game sequels, so nobody really figured out that a new game meant you had to make the same thing again, but better. Rather than being another overhead adventure based around exploration and exhausting possibilities, Zelda 2 focuses a lot more on action with a sword that's barely even longer than my peep. It still offered new things to the series, like NPCs and villages, but it still didn't really feel like a Zelda game. Although, if I'm being honest, I actually have a lot more fun playing this than I do the original. I almost put it in the C tier even, but had I done that, I don't think I'd have been able to look at myself in the mirror. Speaking of the C tier though, let's keep things moving with the most so-so Zelda games in the entire franchise. Phantom Hourglass. A lot of people hate the control method using the stylus, but I don't know, I kinda think it gives this game its own identity. And once you're open to the idea, it offers unique puzzle solutions and it actually controls pretty well. However, this game's one massive flaw is in the Temple of the Ocean King. There's a dungeon you gotta keep revisiting, but the problem with that's that each time you come back, you gotta redo the same sections over and over again. It's a lot easier and quicker to do once you come back with all your upgraded items, but it's still pretty miserable. And I think it's unbelievable that Nintendo would allow such a chore to be in a Zelda game, especially one that wasn't made by obscure Russian developers for the CDI. Other than that, the game is still pretty good, but the below oversized end still deserves a spanking for this stunt. Spirit Tracks. This might be a standalone Zelda game story-wise, but since it uses the same controls as Phantom Hourglass, it's pretty much a spiritual successor. The key difference is here, though, that you're a trained conductor instead of using the open ocean, and instead of your assistant being a fairy, it's actually Zelda herself in the form of a spirit, which actually adds some pretty cool puzzle-solving mechanics. I think this game's better than Phantom Hourglass in every way, because while it does make you visit the same dungeon over and over again like before, you can at least skip the parts you've already completed. But the thing that prevents this game from being in a higher tier, though, is the friggin' flute. It's not so bad once you figure out how the game wants you to play it, but no matter how many times you play it the natural way, the game absolutely refuses to acknowledge your efforts. I've got no idea in hell how this got past testing, and I would explain how it works, but you've either already played this game, or if you haven't, you're probably not going to play it based on me putting it in the C tier. Although, despite the flaw, I would recommend you check it out if you get the chance. Triforce Heroes, Oracle of Ages, Oracle of Seasons, Four Swords, and Four Swords Adventures. You might be asking yourself, what the heck do all these games have in common, you jackass? Well, aside from the multiplayer aspects of 3 of them, nothing at all. But these are the only core Zelda games I never actually beat. I have played them all for at least a little bit, so I know enough about them to know that I like them better than anything in the F and D tiers. And I'm pretty sure I'd rank the Oracle games higher if I finished playing them, but I'll save that for a revision video that I'll probably never make. It sure is cold in here though, so let's turn the heat up with the B tier, shall we? Link's Awakening DX. I've never played the original Link's Awakening on the regular Game Boy, but DX is in color and it has a little bit extra, so that's the version I'm going to be going with. And for the record, at the time of this recording, the Link's Awakening remake hasn't come out yet, but given that it's a complete remake instead of an enhanced port, I definitely would have considered it a separate game. I'll probably just pin a comment in the future and say where that game fits in. As for the Game Boy Color version though, I never actually got around to playing it till long after the fact. So you can sleep tight tonight knowing I didn't let nostalgia influence my decision to put it in a relatively high tier. It may have been made for the original Game Boy, but Nintendo really got everything out of the hardware they could have at the time. Because if you ask me, this game still holds up incredibly well. The soundtrack's underrated, the puzzles and dungeons are well put together, there's Goombas and Piranha Plants for some reason. The game changes your name to Thief if you shoplift, and despite the game feeling so weird, it still feels so Zelda at the same time. My only real gripe with this game's the obscenely long trading sequence towards the end. At first I thought it was pretty cool because I thought it was optional, but you actually have to complete it, and I don't know, I just thought it kind of killed the flow for me. It definitely wasn't enough to ruin the game or anything, but even though it probably was my fault for having so much trouble with it in the first place, I can't help how I feel. Regardless though, I still think it's pretty impressive for a Game Boy game to have made it all the way into the B tier. Minish Cap. Almost nobody talks about this game, and I really have no idea why. Admittedly, I do have a lot of nostalgia towards this game, but even so, I still feel like it honestly might be the most underrated game in the series. It may just be a side game made for a handheld, but the graphics and sound give this game its own unique charm, and at this point, the series pretty much figured out how to make 2D dungeons. There's also some pretty cool items like the Gust Jar, which I wish they'd bring back more, and 100%ing this game's actually practical as opposed to being another case of...
Yeah, no, we're not doing that.
Minish Cap's defining feature, though, is the companion who looks like a hat named Eslo. He's got the ability to shrink Link down to where I know for sure he's got a smaller PP than me, but the main reason he does this is so Link can get into small dungeons and villages inhabited by a people called the Minish. There's a lot of puzzles that involve shrinking down and growing up again, which is similar to the mechanics in other Zelda games, but I feel like the twist here is pretty original. And what earns this game some bonus points for me is the fact that Ganon's not in it. Call me crazy, but I've always wished Nintendo would have more villains instead of just recycling the same ones over and over again.
I don't know.
Hopefully Nintendo releases Game Boy Advance games in the near future though, because people really do need to play this. Breath of the Wild. I feel like I'm gonna have to get a PR department just so they could issue some kind of statement about me putting Breath of the Wild in the B tier, but I mean, come on, I'm not gonna lie. Thankfully, it's somewhat socially acceptable to say something negative about this game now that the honeymoon period wore off. But just to be clear, I really do love Breath of the Wild, and it only missed the A tier by an A hair. I love that Zelda had the grapefruits to try something completely new, but much like most gaming franchises that reinvent themselves besides Resident Evil 4, the first try usually has room for improvement. I think it's awesome to have the option of completing dungeons in whatever order you want. And exploring was so much fun that I just laid in my filth for 145 hours and refused to leave my bed. If you don't believe me, ask my stepdad. It's just that not every goddamn thing in the game needs to give the player 100% freedom. After the perfection of the carefully thought out dungeons in Skyward Sword, Botswa's divine beasts are a disorganized mess and completely lack any flow. And speaking of ruining flow, the rain forces you to either set your controller down and wait for it to pass, or just teleport somewhere else if you plan on doing any climbing at all. I've got a lot more complaints that people don't want to think about, but mark my ass, when Breath of the Wild 2 comes out, the legacy of the first game is going to be that it was a good beginning, but the formula got way better later on. But let's keep things moving along into the A tier, where I'm sure I'm going to ruffle a few more feathers. Skyward Sword. I'm sure a lot of you probably already know this, but when Wind Waker first came out, fans threw a hissy fit all over the place about Link being cel-shaded. Apparently Zelda needs to be super badass and cool like Lord of the Rings or something, I don't know.
Giving the fanboys what they wanted, what they needed, what they desired, Nintendo skipped all that cel-shading crap and delivered the goods on Twilight Princess.
So rather than the planned direct sequel to that game that I'm never gonna forget about, Nintendo released Twilight Princess instead. So after the fans felt like they won or something, Nintendo went back to actually trying to be innovative, and what they came up with was Skyward Sword. A Zelda game based entirely around the Wii Motion Plus, as opposed to substituting the A button for shaking the Wii remote and calling it revolutionary. And surprisingly, fans were actually okay with the unconventional controls for a while, and Skyward Sword was a success, and it got 10s across the board. Well, except for GameSpot, but they got a lot of heat for it at the time. But then everyone just kinda changed their minds and decided decided this is an abomination to the series. But then when Eiji Aonuma teased the game coming to the Switch at a Zelda concert, everyone acted like they loved the game all along. I can see why one would love or hate this game, but in my opinion, it's fine and dandy like sour candy. And I'd even go one step further and say that it's got the absolute best 3D dungeons in the entire series. I don't care what anybody says, Nintendo absolutely mastered the dungeon design here, and I actually think the Wii Motion Plus added a lot to the game by not only keeping the puzzles fresh, but it also made the battles feel pretty unique as well. Although, recalibrating the Wii Remote every time I moved was a pain in my poop. Plus, I hate that they got rid of the pointer controls just to eliminate the sensor bar. Like, yeah, the sensor bar is inconvenient, but it is better for aiming. But while I'm talking about the negatives, I do think the complaints of this game being too linear are completely fair. And if I'm being honest, I'm really not that big a fan of the music either. I mean, it's alright, but I noticed how on Zelda it felt before I even knew Koji Kondo was only a supervisor. I don't know, it just kind of felt like the new composer tried way too hard to make the game feel epic. I feel like I need to take a shower after being so harsh on the soundtrack since I really would have loved it in any other game. But when it comes to music in Zelda games, I'm not gonna apologize for having high standards. Wind Waker HD. I've already talked about this a little bit, but like I said, people hated this game when it first came out, only to change their minds when the HD remaster came out. And for the record, that's the version we're going to be talking about today just because it looks way better. I guess the option for the Swift Sail's an improvement too, but one of the things I liked about the original Wind Waker is that it took a little bit of time to go from island to island. Sailing long distances with occasional pirate attacks while listening to what could possibly be the greatest overworld theme of all time truly made me feel like I was on an adventure. And the cel-shaded graphics definitely hold up a lot better in the long run than if they went for a realistic look. The game's pretty short for a 3D Zelda game, which probably had to do with the fact that it was on a GameCube disc, but I kinda prefer games that don't overstay their welcome anyway. I understand wanting to get your money's worth and all that, but to me, 20 to 30 hours is the perfect length for a game, because I want to play everything. One of the most common complaints with this game is that the Triforce quests in the end suck ass, which I did have trouble with on the GameCube, but even then I was able to beat it without looking anything up. And besides, I was pretty much fixed on the Wii U, so you really can't hold it against it. You're totally blowing it if you never played this before, and if they ever come out with a Switch version, then you owe it to yourself to pick it up. A Link to the Past. I never even looked at this game when I was a kid, which was probably for the best since I wouldn't have had any idea what was going on. But when I played it as a full-grown man, I was really able to appreciate how much they really nailed it. Even though this game was made all the way back in 1991, there really aren't too many negative things you could say about it. I mean, some modern gamers might not be patient enough to figure things out on their own, but to be honest, that's kind of why I like it. It's not impossible to beat without any guidance or anything, but the game's definitely going to put your ass to work and make you exhaust some possibilities. This is one of those games where I don't even mind getting stuck because it's so much fun. However, despite the fact that I love the game not holding your hand, the one reason I kept it out of the S tier is because it went a little too far in being cryptic with how you're supposed to beat Ganon. I really don't think this is a spoiler or anything, but to beat the final boss, you're going to need silver arrows. Which is all well and good, but the problem is the game never tells you a goddamn thing about them. You're just kinda supposed to find them on your own, and I think that's pretty lame in the modern day. I guess it was kinda cool back in the 90s, but right now I got a stepdad to feed. And besides, when I look something up in a video game, one of two things will happen. If the solution isn't cryptic, then I'll feel like an idiot for not giving the developers the benefit of the doubt, or I'll get mad at the game for the solution being so cryptic that nobody would have been able to figure it out naturally. And while the silver arrows aren't impossible to find on your own, and they're not nearly as cryptic as pretty much anything in the first two games, it's kinda pushing that fine line. If the game at least told you about the silver arrows, I'd give it a pass, but as far as I remember, you're just kinda supposed to find them without even knowing they exist. It's really not that big of a deal since we have the internet now, but when I play a retro game, my thoughts are usually something along the lines of, I wanna play this, but is there any cryptic bullshit that you'd never be able to figure out on your own? And for 99% of A Link to the Past, I was thinking, great, they figured things out at this point. But then I tried beating Ganon for hours and I realized I was doing something wrong. Again, it is possible to find the silver arrows without help, but given how good the rest of the game is, you wouldn't expect it to get so cryptic at the end. Aside from that one flaw though, that really isn't that big of a deal and might have just been me being an idiot. This is one of the best Zelda adventures out there, and if you like a challenge that doesn't rely on frustrating the player, then you absolutely must play A Link to the Past. Especially if you consider yourself a Zelda fan. Ocarina Time 3D. Every Zelda game's got an untouchable period where you're not allowed to say anything bad about it unless you want a bottle of ketchup shoved up your ass. However, once that period ends though, people come out of the woodwork to tear the game in question apart. And since the untouchable period for Ocarina of Time was like 15 years, people have been particularly harsh towards it. But even though future games definitely made a lot of improvements, I think Ocarina of Time holds up a lot better than people give it credit for. The soundtrack's full of songs that could easily make it into a video game music hall of fame, and while the graphics don't hold up that well, you still clearly know what everything's supposed to be, and that's good enough for me. The main complaints about this game are usually about the water temple being tedious and Hyrule Field not having a lot to do. But while it would have been nicer if the overworld didn't have so many areas you don't even need to step foot in at any point, it only takes about a minute to get where you're going. Besides, the song that's playing's pretty good, so I don't really think it's a deal breaker or anything. But I will admit that changing boots in the water temple's pretty tedious though. Although, if you're playing it on the 3DS, which is the version we're talking about right now, the touchscreen cuts cuts a lot of the fat out. It is a pain in the ass to fluctuate the water levels, and I'm not trying to say this dungeon's fun, but I was able to figure it out as a kid without a guide or anything. So if you ask my calcium deficient ass, I think the criticism towards this dungeon's a little overdramatic sometimes. The rest of the dungeons are really fun though, especially considering this is Nintendo's first try at a 3D Zelda. And if nostalgia were a factor, Ocarina of Time would have definitely made it into the S rank. Even 20 years later without nostalgia though, I honestly think if you play this game with no knowledge of Zelda with the intention of finishing it alone without a walkthrough, then you're not going to have any problem doing it and you're going to have a great time as well. The length is perfect, the combat's pretty good, new items being sprinkled throughout the game gives the puzzles variety till the very end, and the story is pretty basic, but it's still satisfying to see it through to the end. Twilight Princess. This is the one instance in the Zelda franchise where not including any nostalgia actually helps its cause for me. Because let me tell you, I've got quite a lot of resentment towards this game. As I mentioned earlier, Twilight Princess was originally supposed to be a sequel to Wind Waker, but because people were too insecure to enjoy a cel-shaded video game, we had to get something that didn't feel nearly as fresh as its predecessor. And not only that, but the E3 videos of this game showed fishing with a Wii remote and nunchuck where a command pops up on the screen after you get a bite. So when I got my Wii at launch, I was excited as hell to play this game, and then 15 minutes into it, I'm supposed to catch a fish. And for reasons I didn't understand at the time, a command never popped up, so I literally laid in my bed for hours staring at the screen trying to stay awake. There weren't any walkthroughs or anything I could look at since the game just came out a few hours beforehand, but I eventually got out of this situation when I moved the controller at the right time. But then I had to catch another fish later on, and the exact same thing happened all over again. Needless to say, I was pretty pissed. It was then that I learned that there's two different kinds of fishing in the game. Neat, right? Well, no, because it already took a lot of the experience away from me. But I will be the third or fourth person to admit that I probably just wasn't paying attention when the game told me how to catch the fish in the first place. And besides, nostalgia's not even a factor anyway, so I can't really hold me being an idiot against the game. But even though Twilight Princess is really just Ocarina of Time copy-pasted and given steroids, I can't deny that the game's badass as hell. Everything that made Ocarina of Time great's done even better here, and aside from my own personal experience and contempt towards this game, Twilight Princess is guaranteed fun from start to finish. The only thing that kept it out of the S tier is the fact that it doesn't really bring a whole lot of originality to the table, but even that critique's not that strong since the Twilight mechanics in Wolf Link do give the game its own identity. But let's move on to what I consider to be the real meat and potatoes of the Zelda franchise with the S tier. Majora's Mask 3D. While I still think Ocarina of Time holds up better than people give it credit for, future games did make a lot of improvements. But as far as Majora's Mask goes, there's literally no other game in history like it. It's not everybody's cup of tea, and even when I played it as a kid, I hated it. And fun fact, I also saw Stone Cold at the mall the same day, and I called him a son of a what from the escalator. The reason I didn't like it as a kid is because it has time limits, but that's actually why I love it now. The idea of having 3 days to save the world from impending doom and using the Ocarina of Time to activate Bites the Dusto is original as all hell, especially when you realize they just threw this game together in 2 years. I actually wish Nintendo would make this mechanic into its own franchise, even if it had nothing to do with Zelda. It takes about 54 minutes of real time to pass until all 3 days are up and the world ends, but there are ways to slow or skip time that I wasn't aware of until after the fact. But to be honest, I kinda think it made the game better not knowing how to do that. There may only be 4 dungeons, but unlike Ocarina of Time easing you in, Majora's Mask knew damn well you already played that game. So they just straight up throw you to the wolves right off the bat. Plus, the side quests have a lot more depth to them than pretty much any other Zelda game, with much better rewards than a lame-ass 100 rupees too. Every NPC in the game's important and interesting, and the tone of the game's pretty dark overall. Plus, Tingle makes his debut here, so, you know, there's that. I could go on and on about Majora's Mask for a while, but long story short, this game checks everything off my Zelda checklist to qualify it for the S tier. Not too long to complete? Check. Difficult but not cryptic or frustrating? Check. Originality that gives the game its own identity? Check. Ganon not being the main villain for the millionth time? Not required, but check for bonus points. The bottom line is that while this game might not be for everybody, it's definitely a masterpiece for what it was going for. A Link Between Worlds. Even though this game gets a ton of praise as it is, I dare say it's still underrated. Yeah, people love it, but it's always kind of regarded as a side game just because it's from a top-down perspective on a handheld. Personally, I think this is the very best game in the entire series, though. It'd be easier for me to forgive Breath of the Wild's flaws in its approach to non-linearity, but it's kinda hard to do that when A Link Between Worlds did a better job at the same concept 4 years earlier. There might not be nearly as much to explore here as there is in Breath of the Wild, but I prefer quality over quantity, and I'm sorry, but 20 shrines that test your strength and Korok doo-doo in the end aren't really cutting it for me. After finishing the first dungeon and acquiring the new ability to blend into walls, A Link Between Worlds lets you go wherever you want. But in order to get into certain dungeons, you're gonna need to buy the necessary items to access those areas. This gives you the freedom to complete the dungeons in any order you want, but more importantly, it keeps the puzzles feeling fresh from beginning to end a lot better than having 3 key items. And it also prevents dungeons from feeling like a complete mess. The dungeons in this game are all built around one specific item, and you always need that item to get there in the first place. Skyward Sword's got the best 3D dungeons, but A Link Between Worlds has the best in 2 dimensions. And it's pretty impressive that something as simple as blending into the walls could offer so much to a game. On top of all that, the music's excellent, there's no hand-holding character, the bosses are incredible, there's plenty of fun side quests, and the length of the game is absolutely perfect. It'd been nice if there was a little more challenge, but pound for pound, whatever that means, this is the best Zelda game ever made. But anyway, that's my tier list. The F tier is the CDI Zeldas and Link's crossbow training, the D tier's got Hyrule Warriors, The Legend of Zelda, and Zelda 2. The C tier's Phantom Hourglass, Spirit Tracks, Triforce Heroes, Oracle of Ages, Oracle of Seasons, Four Swords, and Four Swords Adventures. B tier's Minish Cap, Link's Awakening DX, and Breath of the Wild. A tier's the home of Wind Waker HD, A Link to the Past, Ocarina Time 3D, Skyward Sword, and admittedly Twilight Princess HD. Then finally, the S tier consists of Majora's Mask 3D and A Link Between Worlds. Feel free to let me know what your tier is in the comments below, and if I missed anything, then let me know. And as always, I'll try my goddamnedest to respond to everybody. But let me tell you, if there's two people in the world who could transform into S-tier Zelda games, it would definitely be today's patrons of the day, Dojin Shinji and Ninja Robot. If you want to be badasses like these two, then consider supporting FU Game Crew on Patreon for loot boxes in the mail and other wacky rewards. And if you want to make a cameo, then send pictures or videos of you rocking any FU Game Crew merch like these legendary human beings you see before you. As always, like and share this video anywhere on the internet to help this channel grow. And if you want to prove that you're not down with registered sex offenders, then go ahead and press the subscribe button if you haven't already. My name's CameronAllOneWord, and I'll be back with more videos soon.
So I want to say thank you to your loyalty, thank you for your support.